Was Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the most provocative philosophers in history, really a precursor to Nazi ideology? Or was his name unjustly co-opted by a regime he would have likely despised? Let's unpack this contentious issue piece by piece. Let's start with the obvious. Nietzsche couldn't have been a Nazi. Friedrich Nietzsche passed away in 1900, long before Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, NSDAP, emerged on the political stage. Hitler didn't rise to power until 1933, over 3 decades later. The Nazi ideology, as we understand it today, simply didn't exist during Nietzsche's lifetime. So, in a literal sense, the philosopher could not have subscribed to the tenets of Nazism. But here's where it gets complicated. Despite the time gap, Nietzsche's ideas found their way into the fabric of Nazi ideology, or, more accurately, were woven into it. His writings accompanied German soldiers into World War II, tucked into their backpacks as part of field gray editions distributed widely. Meanwhile, Nazi propaganda machine quoted his words to rally their cause. One glaring example, Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's infamous propaganda minister, leaned on Nietzsche's now iconic line, "That which does not kill me makes me stronger." He invoked it during one of the darkest chapters of the war, the defeat at Stalingrad in 1943. Facing a devastating loss that shook the Nazi regime's confidence, Goebbels used Nietzsche's words to project resilience and inspire renewed determination among a demoralized population. But here's the thing. The relationship between Nietzsche's work and Nazi ideology wasn't organic. It was constructed. The Nazis cherry-picked, twisted, and outright distorted Nietzsche's philosophy to suit their purposes. This wasn't a seamless alignment of ideas, but rather a calculated appropriation. Understanding this historical context is essential for unpacking the complexities of how Nietzsche's writings became entangled with the Nazi agenda, and why much of this entanglement has been debunked as a misrepresentation of his actual views. Why the Nazis embraced Nietzsche? The Nazis cleverly manipulated Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy to serve their agenda, despite Nietzsche's strong opposition to nationalism, antisemitism, and authoritarianism. By cherry-picking, distorting, and outright manipulating his work, they twisted his ideas into tools for propaganda. The allure of Nietzsche's philosophy. Nietzsche's bold ideas, like the Ubermensch, rejection of Christian morality, and the will to power, appealed to Nazi thinkers. However, they distorted these concepts to fit their worldview. The Ubermensch. Nietzsche's Ubermensch was about individual transcendence, but Nazi thinkers like Alfred Baumler reinterpreted it as a symbol for the German folk, elevating the German people as superior. Rejection of Christian morality. Nietzsche critiqued Christian morality for promoting weakness, but the Nazis conflated this with their own anti-Semitic agenda. Will to power. Nietzsche's concept of the will to power was about creativity and self-overcoming, but the Nazis warped it into a justification for aggression and conquest. Alfred Baumler and heroic realism. Philosopher Alfred Baumler was instrumental in twisting Nietzsche's ideas into Nazi ideology, promoting war and struggle as essential to human greatness, and elevating the German folk as the embodiment of Nietzsche's Ubermensch. The Nazi propaganda machine. The Nazis selectively edited Nietzsche's works to amplify their distorted version of his philosophy, conveniently ignoring his critiques of nationalism and anti-Semitism. This gave their agenda a veneer of intellectual legitimacy, a philosophy hijacked. Nietzsche would have rejected the Nazi appropriation of his work, as his philosophy directly opposes totalitarianism and dogma. Yet through distortion and propaganda, the Nazis co-opted his ideas to serve their ideology. Next, we'll explore how Nietzsche's sister, Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, played a crucial role in shaping this false narrative. The role of Nietzsche's sister. Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy was misrepresented largely due to his sister, Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche. After Nietzsche's mental collapse in 1889, Elisabeth took control of his works, reshaping them to reflect her own nationalist and anti-Semitic views, which later contributed to the Nazis' appropriation of Nietzsche's ideas. Elisabeth's agenda. While Nietzsche rejected nationalism and anti-Semitism, Elisabeth embraced them. She was married to an ardent anti-Semite and co-founded a failed Aryan settlement in Paraguay. When Nietzsche could no longer oversee his work, Elizabeth began editing and curating his writings to support her beliefs. The Nietzsche Archive. In 1894, Elizabeth established the Nietzsche Archive in Weimar, claiming to preserve her brother's legacy. In reality, she manipulated his unpublished works, removing critiques of nationalism and antisemitism. She even forged letters to make Nietzsche appear supportive of Aryan ideals, directly contradicting his true views, aligning with the Nazis. By the 1930s, Elizabeth's edits found favor with the Nazi Party. She aligned the archive with the regime, and Hitler visited regularly. Elizabeth's efforts solidified Nietzsche's posthumous association with the Nazis, despite his opposition to their core beliefs. The true Nietzsche versus Elizabeth's Nietzsche. Nietzsche's true philosophy opposed nationalism, authoritarianism, and anti-Semitism. His rejection of herd mentality and glorification of individual creativity was at odds with the Nazi ideals Elizabeth embraced. Yet her manipulations successfully tied Nietzsche's name to a regime he would have abhorred. The impact of Elizabeth's manipulations. Elizabeth's distortions have clouded Nietzsche's legacy, casting him as a supporter of the very totalitarianism he despised. Scholars have spent years working to separate the true Nietzsche from the myth she created. Chapter 4. What Nietzsche actually believed. To truly grasp Nietzsche's philosophy, it's crucial to separate his actual beliefs from the political ideologies of his time and the distortions that followed. Let's explore the core ideas that define his thought: his rejection of nationalism and racism, his critique of state power, and his vision of the Ubermensch. Against nationalism and racism, Nietzsche didn't mince words when it came to nationalism, especially the kind that was taking root in Germany during his lifetime. He despised Teutonism, the glorification of the Germanic race, and outright rejected the notion of racial superiority. Nietzsche's views were in direct opposition to the racial ideologies that the Nazis would later latch onto. Nietzsche's stance on anti-Semitism. Although Nietzsche's philosophy was later twisted by his sister and Nazi ideologues, his actual views on anti-Semitism were crystal clear. Nietzsche not only rejected anti-Semitic sentiments, but he also admired the intellectual contributions of Jewish people to European culture. His famous break with composer Richard Wagner, who became increasingly anti-Semitic, was rooted in Wagner's racial theories and attempts to spread them through art. Nietzsche was blunt about it: have nothing to do with a person who takes part in the dishonest race swindle. This pointed rejection of racial discrimination underscores a fundamental aspect of Nietzsche's philosophy: a disdain for anti-Semitism and racism. The tragic irony is that his ideas were later hijacked by the very people he would have despised. Critique of state power. Another pillar of Nietzsche's philosophy was his critique of state power. He saw modern states as cold monsters, obsessed with bureaucratic conformity, mass control, and stifling individuality. To Nietzsche, the state wasn't a force for human flourishing, but a tool for homogenizing society, suppressing the very creativity and greatness that he valued. For Nietzsche, individual freedom and greatness were paramount. He saw the state as something that crushed the human spirit, forcing people to conform to collective norms rather than pursue their own higher potential. He believed in the individual's power to break free from societal expectations and create their own meaning in life. The Ubermensch, a philosophical ideal, not a political tool. One of the most misunderstood and misused concepts in Nietzsche's work is the idea of the Ubermensch, or overman, often mistranslated as Superman. The Nazis, particularly through the writings of Alfred Baumler, twisted this concept into a justification for racial superiority and authoritarian rule. But for Nietzsche, the Ubermensch was never meant as a political or racial ideal. Instead, the Ubermensch was a philosophical idea, an individual who transcends conventional morality and societal expectations. It's about self-overcoming, creating new values and living authentically. Nietzsche envisioned the Ubermensch as someone who embraces life's challenges, constantly evolves, and overcomes limitations. It was never about domination or establishing a master race, as the Nazis would later claim. Nietzsche's Ubermensch is profoundly individualistic and personal. It rejects submission to any external authority, including the state. It's about the triumph of the individual spirit, the capacity to create meaning in a world that often seems indifferent or chaotic. Conclusion. By understanding Nietzsche's true beliefs, his rejection of nationalism and racism, his critique of state power, and his vision of the Ubermensch as a self-overcoming individual, it becomes clear that the Nazis' use of his work was a tragic distortion. Nietzsche's philosophy was fundamentally about human flourishing, personal freedom, and intellectual honesty, values that were the exact opposite of the Nazi agenda. In the end, Nietzsche's ideas were co-opted by those who either misunderstood or deliberately twisted them to suit their own agenda. The philosopher who championed individual greatness, loathed nationalism and antisemitism, and rejected the power of the state would undoubtedly have been horrified by how his work was misused to advance ideologies he despised. Chapter 5. The Nazi Misuse of Nietzsche. Nietzsche's work, known for its intellectual depth and philosophical complexity, was unfortunately reduced to a mere tool of Nazi propaganda. The Nazis, in their quest for power, cherry-picked and oversimplified his ideas, twisting them to justify their destructive agenda. They ignored Nietzsche's subtle warnings and the more profound meanings behind his writings. The simplification of Nietzsche's ideas. The Nazis, particularly Joseph Goebbels and Alfred Baumler, eagerly seized on Nietzsche's writings that appeared to support their ideas of strength and superiority. However, they selectively ignored the parts of his philosophy that criticized war, collectivism, and authoritarianism. For example, Nietzsche's warning against the barbarity of war was lost on the Nazis, who celebrated conflict as a noble pursuit. They gravitated toward Nietzsche's concept of the Ubermensch, the Overman or Superman, but reinterpreted it as a tool for promoting the racial purity of the Aryan race, an idea Nietzsche would have vehemently rejected. Ignoring Nietzsche's anti-collectivism. One of the core tenets of Nietzsche's philosophy was his disdain for collectivism in all forms. He viewed the state, whether democratic or totalitarian, as a cold monster, focused on conformity and the suppression of individual greatness. Yet the Nazis, who operated under an intensely collectivist regime, ignored this aspect of Nietzsche's thought. Nietzsche saw the individual as the ultimate source of power and creativity, not the collective will or the subjugation of minorities. In his critique of the herd mentality, Nietzsche championed personal sovereignty and freedom of thought, concepts that would have been completely antithetical to the authoritarian Nazi regime. The distortion by Nazi philosophers. Nazi philosophers, most notably Baumler, took liberties with Nietzsche's ideas, stripping them of their nuanced complexity. Baumler reinterpreted Nietzsche's work as a justification for war, power, and conquest, concepts that Nietzsche himself criticized. Through this distorted lens, Nietzsche was made to appear as an advocate for the very principles that the Nazis cherished: racial superiority, nationalism, and unyielding strength. But Nietzsche, in reality, was a critic of any ideology that suppressed individual will, whether it came in the form of nationalism, religion, or state power. The dissonance. Nietzsche's true philosophy versus Nazi ideology. Despite the Nazis' attempts to co-opt Nietzsche, there's a fundamental dissonance between his philosophy and their ideology. Nietzsche was deeply critical of the values that underpinned Nazi thought. While he rejected Christianity and democratic ideals, he also rejected any form of blind obedience to a collective or state ideology. The Nazis, by contrast, promoted racial purity, totalitarianism, and mass conformity. Nietzsche's rejection of Christianity, for example, was tied to his belief in individual transcendence, not the destruction of whole peoples or the celebration of racial supremacy. His Ubermensch was not an ideal rooted in race or power over others, but a symbol of personal evolution, an individual striving to overcome limitations and live authentically. In conclusion, Nietzsche's philosophy was co-opted and misused by the Nazis in ways that betrayed its essence. While there were certain elements in Nietzsche's work, such as his critiques of democracy and Christianity, that might have aligned with Nazi ideology, the core of his thought was fundamentally at odds with the Nazi pursuit of racial purity, militarism, and totalitarianism. The Nietzsche the Nazis embraced was not the Nietzsche who wrote about individual freedom, creativity, and the dangers of blind collective obedience. Rather, it was a distorted Nietzsche, selectively edited and manipulated to serve the ends of a regime that Nietzsche would likely have despised. Chapter 6. Why this misinterpretation matters. The Nazi distortion of Nietzsche's philosophy has overshadowed his true legacy, unfairly associating him with ideologies he vehemently critiqued. It's vital to correct this misunderstanding, not just to restore Nietzsche's place in intellectual history, but to highlight the dangers of using philosophy for political manipulation. Nietzsche's true legacy. Nietzsche's work offers deep insights into power, the self, and society, emphasizing individualism and the rejection of herd mentality. His concept of the Ubermensch, a symbol of personal transformation and overcoming limitations, is a roadmap for self-actualization, not for authoritarian rule or racial purity. Unfortunately, the Nazis co-opted his ideas, overshadowing their true meaning and causing many to wrongly associate Nietzsche with Nazism. The dangers of misusing philosophy. The Nazis' selective manipulation of Nietzsche's ideas highlights a troubling trend, twisting philosophy to serve political agendas. Nietzsche's critique of conformity and traditional morals made his work ripe for misinterpretation. The Nazis cherry-picked elements of his thought to align with their ideology, ignoring his broader rejection of nationalism and authoritarianism. This manipulation underscores the need to engage with philosophy in full context rather than using it to justify harmful agendas. Reclaiming Nietzsche for today. Correcting the historical record is crucial for both Nietzsche's legacy and the integrity of philosophical thought. His critique of nationalism, antisemitism, and authoritarianism is more relevant than ever in today's political climate. By reevaluating his work, we can reclaim Nietzsche's true message, a call for self-overcoming, individual empowerment, and resistance to societal pressures, not a justification for domination. This is the Nietzsche we should celebrate, not the distorted figure of Nazi appropriation. Chapter 7. Final Thoughts. Did Nietzsche influence Nazism? As we reach the end of this examination, we must return to the question that sparked this debate. Did Friedrich Nietzsche actually influence Nazism? On the surface, it's easy to see why some might think Nietzsche's critiques of democracy, his emphasis on struggle, and his rejection of traditional moral values could align with Nazi ideology. After all, Nazi propaganda exploited these aspects to justify their actions. But as we dig deeper, the overlap between Nietzsche's ideas and the Nazi movement is not only superficial, it is severely distorted. The limited overlap, a superficial connection. The Nazis latched on to select elements of Nietzsche's thought, his disdain for democratic institutions, his celebration of struggle, and his vision of human greatness. They cherry-picked these ideas to fit a narrative that suited their totalitarian and racially motivated agenda. However, they ignored the far more significant aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy that directly contradicted their views. For example, Nietzsche's strong opposition to nationalism and his rejection of any form of state worship completely undermines the Nazi ideal of a glorified, unified German state. In Nietzsche's view, nationalism was a form of herd mentality, something that suppressed the individual in favor of collective identity. He loathed the idea of the state as a force that coerces individuals into conformity. The Nazis, on the other hand, saw the state as a means of consolidating power and enforcing a homogeneous national identity. Nietzsche would have seen this as anathema to his vision of human potential. Nietzsche's anti-Semitism. Perhaps most glaring of all is the issue of anti-Semitism. While Nietzsche's philosophy critiques the influence of Judeo-Christian morality on Western culture, he did not share the Nazis' hatred of Jews. In fact, Nietzsche's disdain for anti-Semitism was one of the reasons he broke ties with his former friend, Richard Wagner, who had become infamous for his virulent anti-Semitic views. Nietzsche actively rejected the idea of racial purity, a cornerstone of Nazi ideology, and was outspoken about the dangers of anti-Semitic thought. The Nazis, in their zeal to appropriate his ideas, simply ignored or distorted these aspects of his work. The irony of Nietzsche and the Nazis. The most bitter irony of all is that the Nazis, who sought to elevate their own idea of racial superiority, were unwittingly embracing a philosopher who would have been disgusted by their ideology. Nietzsche's emphasis on individualism, self-overcoming, and the rejection of mass conformity makes him the polar opposite of the Nazi vision of a homogeneous, racially pure society. He envisioned the Ubermensch as an individual who transcends conventional morality and social norms, not as a figure of racial dominance or authoritarian rule. In essence, the Nazis' misuse of Nietzsche's ideas reveals a profound misunderstanding, or perhaps willful distortion, of his philosophy. Nietzsche's writings were never intended to justify violence, domination, or racial purity. He was far more concerned with the flourishing of the individual and the cultivation of personal strength and creativity. His ideas were not about creating a master race, but about challenging the limitations imposed by society, religion, and culture. Final verdict: no, Nietzsche did not influence Nazism. After examining the facts, it becomes clear, while Nietzsche's work was misappropriated by the Nazis, he did not, in any meaningful sense, influence their ideology. The Nazis selectively quoted his work to serve their own agenda, but the essence of his philosophy stands in direct opposition to the core principles of Nazism. Nietzsche's critiques of state power, nationalism, and antisemitism, along with his vision of the Ubermensch as a self-overcoming individual, paint a picture of a man whose ideas were incompatible with the totalitarian, racially exclusive vision of the Nazis. In the end, Nietzsche's true legacy is one of intellectual freedom, individualism, and the rejection of herd mentality. It's a legacy that the Nazis hijacked, twisted, and misused for their own nefarious purposes. But by understanding Nietzsche in his full, nuanced context, we can separate the man from the myths and reclaim his ideas as a powerful force for challenging tyranny and embracing human potential.